basically trying to get our minds around the fact that God is with us even when the world seems to be falling apart. Okay, and there is this difficulty, this tension in life between the reality of what is and the reality that God is in the midst of those terrible things that happen. You know, I just wish that sometimes, like, I could see the world the way God sees the world. Don't you wish that? Like, you could be able to see the world around you the way God sees it. Because God has a dream that every person on this planet will know Him. God has a dream that every person is going to come alive in Him and be who they have always been meant to be, who God has created them to be. God has a dream that every person is going to live into that, which is great and awesome, of course, but the problem is, if you're anything like me, you look around the world and you're like, I'm not sure I totally buy that when I see some people around me. I know this better than most because I used to be a youth director. I worked with 6th through 12th graders, and when you have a 12th grader, you can kind of begin to see, oh, this is like a normal human being. But when you receive a 6th grader, you realize this is the furthest thing from a human being that exists. Anyone that's ever worked with middle schoolers for any amount of time knows these are subhuman creatures. Okay? And you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're saying that in church. We are an honest place here. Okay? And if you disagree with me, then you're wrong. You haven't spent much time with them. I'm going to stand on the truth of the gospel of that. The truth is, though, there are just people, like these junior hires that I've worked with, they plague my dreams at times. From their dumb prayer requests, like, there's this one girl this one time that raised her hand during prayer request time, which is always a terrible idea. Does anybody have any prayer requests? My family has lost all hope. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the worst. She's like, my dog chewed through our washing machine cables. And I'm like, that's not losing hope. That's a bad day. We don't lose hope over that. And it's like, okay, fine, shut up, 7th grader. We'll get by. To like really dumb things where it's like fart jokes and like, you know, let's you know, throw rocks at each other for fun. I actually worked a camp one time where these dumb boys, like I don't know, I guess we should have given them like baseballs or something. Instead, they took rocks and they were like, let's play dodgeball with these rocks. And I'm like, you idiots. Like, I can't stitch you up, and so, like, I killed them, and that was it. No, it was the worst thing to deal with these people. But there was this one time, and this wasn't even a junior hire. This was a 9th grader at that. You know, you expect more out of your senior highs. We are at the beach, like normal youth groups do. And I have just enjoyed a wonderful afternoon getting my tan on, enjoying the waves and just God's creation, worshiping in nature. Anybody worship in nature? Oh, man, I was about to say nature worshiper, but I'm not a nature worshiper. I'm not pagan, but I'm a worshiper in nature. I am returning, and we're getting ready for worship that evening because we would pile into one of our condos, sort of living room, and we would worship in there. And I hear this cry from a junior hire saying, oh my God, someone's peeing off the roof. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. And I look up, and I won't describe what I saw, but I did see the stream coming from the top floor of this 16-floor condo complex, streaming down onto the sidewalk, mere 15 feet in front of me. And I was like, this little person was aiming for me. I mean, not just like casually, oh my gosh, I can't make it to the restroom. He is aiming for me, and I don't even have to look and see the face. I know who it is, and so I hop on the elevator up there, and we have quite a talk. This kid, oh my gosh, if there was something that could go wrong, it was because of this kid on every trip. He was one of those that was the thorn in my side. Paul would call him the thorn in my flesh. Okay, God, please take him away. My grace is sufficient for you. And I'm like, no, please take him away. And he's one of those students. You're like, you're really talking bad about people. I'm like, y'all, I'm a terrible person. I understand that. That's why I'm venting to you tonight. Anyway, this kid was a thorn in my side, and yet still, I was like, I'm going to take him on these trips. We went to one trip, and it was a music festival, y'all. And we're in these giant fields, and like amazing things are happening. There are killer speakers, people that like, world-renowned like speakers. They're like talking at us. And there's this one moment on one of these nights where there was an altar call. And so as a youth pastor, when the preacher is giving the message, and he says, okay, now everybody shut your eyes and bow your heads. The youth pastor doesn't do that. The youth pastor opens his eyes or her eyes, and they're looking around to see if any of their kids raise their hands or stand up and say, hey, I'd like to know Jesus today. Well, I open up my eyes, and I look over, and it's P Kid. And I'm like, him. He is saying, here I am, Lord. This is me. And I was like, okay, we'll see how long this lasts. So we all open our eyes, and they play a final song, and then they say, if you raised your hand or said, hey, Jesus, I'm all in or whatever, then come over to this special tent, which sounds kind of culty, I understand, but it made sense. So I stood up with him, and I began to walk over there with him, and we start to talk, and he gives me this beautiful story about how, like I'd never really thought about it before, but it just feels like there was a lot of bad stuff in my heart. And then Jesus just like scooped those things out, and I'm just like brand new. And I'm like, I remember you peeing at me from the balcony. I hold a grudge, y'all. He wasn't a perfect kid after that. He continued to do stupid things. He no longer peed off balconies, but sometimes he would jump off of them into pools. Sometimes he would lead junior hires in doing some stupid things, even his sophomore, junior, and senior year. And I would consult other people on the pastoral staff, and I would say, what do we do about this kid? What do we do about this kid? And they would tell me horror stories of him and other students like him. And you know what? I listened to them. And I was like, okay, we just have to contain this kid. As I look back, I just wonder, what was God thinking in all of these moments? What did God see in this dumb kid? I am sad to say that I was filled with fury and anger and disappointment over this bonehead kid, even after he became a Christian. I just want to have eyes that see people the way God sees them. I want to have eyes that see people the way that God sees them. Especially when it is such a pain in my side, a pain in my neck, right? The thing about this series we've been doing with Jeremiah and the king Zedekiah that he works with is that Jeremiah has eyes to see things that people around him do not see. You see, everybody around Jeremiah, they see invading armies surrounding Jerusalem, okay? Surrounding Jerusalem, about to pounce on to the city. And Jeremiah sees them as well, but while the officials and the kings around him all say, we've got to batten down the hatches, we've got to fight, we've got to liberate Jerusalem, we have got to go for this, Jeremiah senses that God is wanting to do something different. What does Jeremiah sense? Jeremiah senses we are not going to overcome Babylon because Babylon may actually be sent by God to us. Now, when he says that, he's accused of treason, just like normal people would say. You're telling us we need to surrender to our enemy at the gates? And we in America are like, no, down with them. We must destroy all contenders for American throne. Jeremiah, however, is saying, no, this is bigger than us. And he begins to prophesy all kinds of terrible things. That's why Jeremiah is a sad book, because he's saying to the promised people, the chosen people who have inherited the promised land, he says to them, this is not going to end well for you or me. This is going to be bad. So we need to recognize what God is doing and put our trust in God. King Zedekiah, when he ascended the throne, he was 21 years old, about your age. Several years later, he has tried his very best to navigate the dicey relationships between the armies that surround him, the Babylonians, who, by the way, put him in charge as king. He's trying to be faithful to them, but he's also trying to nurture a rebellion, saying, maybe we can beat them. Now, the reason he's doing that is because there are people all around him that are giving him advice. And he is going from person to person to person, trying to figure out, what is it that I'm supposed to do? We pick up tonight in Jeremiah chapter 38, beginning in verse 14. Here's what it says. King Zedekiah ordered that the prophet Jeremiah be brought to him at the third entrance of the Lord's temple, where the king said to Jeremiah, I want to ask you something, and don't hide anything from me. And so the king has a secret meeting with Jeremiah. Jeremiah replies, if I do, you'll kill me. And if I tell you what to do, you won't listen to me. Now, Jeremiah has reason for doing this. Zedekiah pulled Jeremiah out of prison. Okay? Not just any prison, but he had been lowered into a cistern, a pit, a well, where there were ropes around his armpits, and he was lowered down, and he was basically going to starve to death. But Zedekiah now needs something from him. And so he commands people, hey, bring him on out. And he's like, Jeremiah, I need some help here. I need you to speak to me honestly. And so Jeremiah says, you are not treating me well. Zedekiah responds, he swore to Jeremiah behind closed doors, as the Lord lives who has given us this life, I won't put you to death, and I won't hand you over to those who seek to kill you. So Jeremiah then said to Zedekiah, this is what I've been saying for a while. He said, the Lord of heavenly forces, the God of Israel proclaims, if you surrender to the officers of the king of Babylon, you and your family will live, and this city will not be burned down. If you don't surrender to the officers of the king of Babylon, the city will be handed over to the Babylonians, who will burn it down, and you won't escape from them. King Zedekiah responds this way, I'm afraid that I will fall into the hands of the Judeans, the Jews, who have defected to the Babylonians, and they will torture me. So in the back of Zedekiah's mind, he's saying, I'm afraid of these people over here. Because if I step out of line, then they're going to get me. And Jeremiah says, well, that won't happen if you obey the Lord, whose message I bring. You will survive, and all will go well for you. But if you refuse to surrender, this is what the Lord has shown me. All the women left in the palace of the king of Judah will be led out to the officers of the king of Babylon, and they will say, your trusted friends have betrayed you. They have deceived you. Now that your feet are stuck in the mud, they are nowhere to be found. Man, I know that you've never had the issue of being invaded by Babylon. I get that. You're like, why are you rambling on and on about this war that happened so long ago? The reason is because you are like King Zedekiah, and so am I. We see the people around us. We hear the voices of those around us. We hear the voices of those on campus. We hear those trusted friends of ours. And sometimes the ways of our trusted friends do not match up with God's ways. Sometimes we are more interested in saying to another person, whether it's someone here at Wesley or someone in your class or somebody in your dorm or maybe it's a roommate or a friend or something, we are trying to get everybody's perspective. What do you think I should do? How would you handle this? And that can be so good if it lines up with what God says. But what Jeremiah says to Zedekiah here, if you disobey what God is saying here, people will say this about you: your trusted friends have betrayed you. They've deceived you. And now that your feet are stuck in the mud, they are nowhere to be found. Jeremiah is speaking some truth to Zedekiah, but he's speaking some deep truth to you and me as well. Does the advice that you receive from friends, neighbors, peers, even family, does it match up with what God is saying to you? And you're like, I'm not really sure what God is saying to me. God didn't exactly appear in a burning bush or whatever. I would absolutely listen to God if God set some things on fire and was like, hey, come talk to this burning piece of foliage. I would totally listen to that God. But that is just not the way it is sometimes. And so, but my friends are right here, and then like I'm afraid that like if I go against what they say or what they would do, or if I stick out too much, then it's just not going to go well for me. Jeremiah is more concerned with what God has to say than what the world around him is saying, and that's so important for each of us. Jeremiah continues, all your wives and children will be led out to the Babylonians, and you yourself won't escape from them. The king of Babylon will capture you, and this city will be burned down. And Zedekiah said to Jeremiah, no one is to know about these matters, or else you will die. If the officials find out that we met and they come and say to you, tell us what you said to the king, don't hide anything from us, otherwise we'll kill you. If they say that, then you should say to them, I was begging the king not to send me back to the house of Jonathan to die there. Well, then all the officials approached Jeremiah to question him, and he responded exactly as the king had instructed him. So they stopped interrogating him because the conversation between the king and Jeremiah hadn't been overheard. Whew. Jeremiah remained in prison quarters until Jerusalem was captured. Do you see, even there, Zedekiah is so concerned what people are thinking outside of those quarters. He's so concerned that his reputation would be marred. But Jeremiah is steadfast. Ultimately, Zedekiah made his decision. He wanted everyone's opinion. He went around, he was processing this major issue by listening to everyone's opinion except God's. He even wanted to please Jeremiah, but he couldn't please everyone. So who are you trying to please in your life? The difference with Jeremiah is that he began to see what no one else was seeing, and he would ask this question that changes somebody's life if they start to ask it. God, I don't like what I'm seeing, but what are you doing? When was the last time in a time of trouble or strife you turned to God and instead of praying, oh God, just help me. Oh God, just bless me. Oh God, when was the last time you said, God, what are you up to? Because when you ask that question, what are you up to? You're assuming something. What are you assuming? That God is up to something. That God is actually alive and active. That's the beauty of prayer. Prayer is not just some boring wish list that we give to God. Prayer is a relational, it's a conversational moment between you and God where you can say to God, God, what are you doing? I don't understand. Show me what you see. Show me what you're doing. Zedekiah never picked up on that. Here's what happened to him. In the 9th year, in the 10th month of Judah's king Zedekiah, Babylon's king Nebuchadnezzar and his entire army came against Jerusalem, surrounded it. And in the 11th year of Zedekiah, on the 9th day of the 4th month, they broke through the city walls. Then all the commanding officers of the king of Babylon, a bunch of people, the chief officer, Nergal-Sharezer, the field commander, entered it and took their places at the middle gate with the rest of the officials of the king of Babylon. When Judah's king Zedekiah, listen to this, and his troops saw them, what did they do? They deserted. They tried to escape at night through the royal gardens and the gate between the two walls toward the desert plain, but the Babylonian army chased them down, caught Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho. They arrested him, brought him before Babylon's king Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah in the land of Hamath. There the king put him on trial. Now listen to this. The king of Babylon slaughtered Zedekiah's children at Riblah before his very own eyes. And the king of Babylon slaughtered all the officials of Judah. Then he gouged out Zedekiah's eyes, bound him in chains, and dragged him off to Babylon. The Babylonians burned down the royal palace and the houses of the people, and they destroyed the Jerusalem walls. I think it's really interesting. Zedekiah could not see what God was doing, and what was taken from him? His eyes. Zedekiah could not see what God was doing among him, among the people, with this nation. And the very last thing that he ever saw with his own eyes was Babylon killing his sons and every official. That was the last thing he ever saw. The sad thing is that we spend so much time looking around in life, and when we have a problem, when we have someone that's an issue in our life, we are looking around to the left, to the right, straight in front of us, trying to find some solution. We're asking, we're Googling, we're doing whatever it takes, but we don't stop to turn our eyes toward God and say, God, what are you doing? No, we go to every single possibility. When we're lonely, what do? We get on Bumble. We get on Tinder. When we're feeling down and out and depressed, what do? We go out with those people that are going to lift our spirits, but maybe not in the best ways. We go to the wells of people and things that drag us down. And we know that in our best moments, but sometimes we're so desperate that we're willing to try anything. Jeremiah's story reminds us we have got to lift our eyes up to God. So, that's what happened to Zedekiah, but what happened to Jeremiah? The Lord's word came to Jeremiah when he was still in prison, confined to the prison quarters. Go and say to Ebed-Melech the Cushite, that means nothing to you, I get that. Go say to this person, that the Lord of heavenly forces, the God of Israel proclaims, I'm about to fulfill my words concerning this city for harm and not for good. You will witness it for yourself on that day. But on that day, declares the Lord, I will rescue you, and you won't be handed over to those you dread. And so, through this story, Jeremiah is ultimately set free. He is brought into some freedom. And you can imagine as he is being led into freedom, bound in chains still perhaps, on his way out, he is wondering, how in the world did we get here? In fact, in the book of Lamentations, we have a lot of sorrow. I'm going to pick up in chapter 3 where he starts to get a little bit more happy and praising of of God. But the thing is, the first 2 chapters, Jeremiah is walking through the city and he's like, this beautiful city, I remember what it used to be. I remember when children would laugh and play and now they're starving in the streets. I remember the majesty of these buildings and now they are in ruins. Sometimes when we are facing terrible things in life, that's the reality, and that's where our story stops. We look at the ruins and we say, this is it. This is the worst thing, and there is no hope. Jeremiah, in chapter 3 of Lamentations, says this, though. Looking at all of these things, he says, yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. It feels like we are consumed right now, by the way, Jeremiah. Like if Babylon has killed a ton of people. Our king is blind, if he's even our king anymore. What does that even mean? It feels like we're consumed, but Jeremiah says we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Isn't that the hardest thing, though? When we're in that waiting period of, God, what are you doing? It's so hard for us to wait and to see what God is up to. If we're in the pit, if we've got the chains around our armpits like Jeremiah had, we're not saying, it is good to wait upon the Lord. That's not what we're doing. We're panicking. We're like, I'm suffocating, I'm starving, I'm dying. Do you even care? You've abandoned me, God. All these people, somebody help me. Somebody help me. But Jeremiah has this amazing steadfastness to his faith. And he says, it is good. It is good that we patiently wait on God. I don't know what you're waiting on God for. And I know that some of you may have been waiting for a very long time. And it sucks that people around you are getting their lives together before you do. It sucks that person over there who's been a failure their whole life has figured out their major and they got an internship that you didn't, and they never struggle in classes like you do, but you are following God and that person doesn't. It sucks. It sucks that person got engaged and you can't get a date. It just flat out sucks. It sucks that there are things in life that are beyond your control and you just feel defeated. And I don't have any proof of saying this to you except 34 years of experience, and only 20 of them with God, by the way. All I can say is that waiting on God is worth it. And you're like, what do you know? You're 34 years old and single. I don't have a date in years. And you're telling me that it's all going to turn out okay? Well, here's what I know. Here's what I know. God has not failed me. I don't believe that God's going to fail you either. Whether I've got tons or I've got nothing, whether I am on top of the world or whether I am in the depths of despair, God has not left me. But at every point, the question that sustains me is not, is God real? But it's this: God, what are you doing? Because you have not proven yourself to be unfaithful to me ever. So what are you doing now? In Jeremiah chapter 40, we kind of get the rest of this story for Jeremiah. It says, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah after Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, had released him at Ramah. He had found Jeremiah bound in chains among all the captives from Jerusalem and Judah who were being carried into exile to Babylon. Now listen to this. When the commander of the guard of Babylon found Jeremiah, he said to him, the Lord your God decreed this disaster for this place. And now the Lord has brought it about. He's done just as he said he would. All this happened because you people sinned against the Lord and didn't obey him. But today I'm freeing you from the chains on your wrists. Come with me to Babylon if you like, and I'll look after you. But if you don't want to, then don't come. But look, the whole country lies before you. Go wherever you please. Here's what's amazing. Jeremiah had lived his faith in captivity, enduring all kinds of beatings and violence against him. He'd been thrown in the pit. He'd been ridiculed and mocked. And when everything was done, he was faithful. And who noticed? But this commander of Babylon. Why should a commander of Babylon ever say anything good about Jeremiah's God? He shouldn't. He shouldn't even know about Jeremiah's God. Babylon has plenty of gods, but there was something about the way Jeremiah lived in the midst of destruction. Zedekiah was not the model to follow here. This commander didn't give a rip what Zedekiah believed in, but he sees Jeremiah and he says, you're different. Because when the world around you was falling apart, you stood up. When everyone else was deserting, you stood up. You really believed this. And the commander of Babylon says, all this happened because you people sinned against the Lord. God's heart is for all people. And when we stop and we say, what role is God playing in this heartache, in this hardship? Maybe after we look to God, that's when we look to the people around us. For Jeremiah, he comes out of prison and suddenly you've got like a profession of faith where this commander is saying, okay, your God is doing some things. This is the story throughout the scriptures. Some 587 years later, Jesus shows up. And Jesus lives for 30 some odd years. And in his last day, he is put on a cross. And as he is dying, he says a lot of things. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. He says things like, my God, why have you forsaken me? In showing solidarity with the world around him in those moments that we say, God, why have you forsaken me? He says all kinds of things, and a few followers stay right there at the foot of the cross. And when finally Jesus says, it is finished, and he breathes his last, who is there at the foot of the cross? But a Roman soldier, the one who had crucified him, looking up and said, truly, This one is the Son of God. Now, we look at the cross and we say that is the worst thing that could ever happen. That's the Savior of the world being killed. But in that moment, that Roman sees this tragedy in Jesus standing firm to the very end, not even knowing about the resurrection yet. He looks at Jesus and he says, surely this was God's Son. I wonder what tragedy, what pain, what difficulty you have endured through which someone else might say, Jesus is alive in that person. That person stayed faithful through it all. And I want to know how. I wish that I've looked at people the way that God looks at them. Because I've looked at them like they were that commander of Babylon, saying they could never possibly do anything for God. I've looked at people as though they were a Roman guard with the spear in hand, the nail through Jesus' wrist. I've looked at people as though they were the enemy, and I bet you have too. And I wish I could go back and look at people differently. Fortunately, through modern media, we have that ability a little bit. And so I actually, over the last few months, have been sort of stalking this former kid. The one that peed off the balcony at me, the thorn in my flesh, the one that I prayed for and rued the day that God ever brought him into my life. Well, you'll all be happy to know that that prayer that he prayed in that field stuck. The kid's doing amazing things for God. In fact, he's starting a new camp. After working in camp ministry for years, he got an opportunity to start a brand new camp to help kids like him when he was that age. The beauty of the gospel is this. It can take someone through the hardest place and turn that thing, that situation, into something that could be a megaphone to the rest of the world of the greatness of God. And it begins with you and me looking at the world around us and saying, God, what are you up to? Instead of saying, that person is not worth my time, that person annoys me, I hate that person, we look to God first. Instead of like bringing down the hammer on that person, we look to God and we say, what are you up to in that person? How can I help? What are you doing in this situation? So many of us have such judgment about people in this city or maybe on this campus or in other organizations on this campus. What would it look like for you to say, God, what are you up to over there? That shows more faith than anything because you actually believe that God is active. As we close tonight, I invite you to pray with me. So would you bow for a word of prayer?